The rope waited in the corner of the stone jailhouse like a coiled snake, and Clara Ashford could not stop staring at it, even though every glance made her stomach turn with fresh terror. She sat on the narrow cot in her cell, hands trembling in her lap, knowing that when the sun rose over Deadwood, South Dakota tomorrow morning, that rope would be around her neck, and her feet would be dancing on nothing but air. The Vigilantes had decided her fate 3 hours ago in a mock trial that lasted all of 20 minutes, and nobody in this God-forsaken town seemed inclined to question their judgment. Clara was 22 years old, and she had never killed anyone in her life, but that did not matter to the 15 men who had appointed themselves judge and jury. They said she had poisoned Marcus Thornton, the wealthy mine owner who had been courting her for the past 2 months. They said she had done it for his money, for the deed to his claim that sat somewhere in his office safe. They said a lot of things, and not one of them was true, but truth seemed to be in short supply in Deadwood these days. The reality was that Marcus Thornton had died clutching his chest in the middle of the Golden Nugget saloon, his face purple and his eyes bulging, and Clara had been standing 3 feet away with a glass of lemonade in her hand. The town doctor said it was poison. The Vigilantes said it was her. And now she was going to hang for a crime she did not commit, while the real killer walked free, probably laughing at how neatly everything had fallen into place. Clara pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear. The cell smelled like old sweat and desperation, and through the barred window she could see the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Her last sunset. The thought made her throat tighten and her eyes burn with unshed tears. She had come to Deadwood 6 months ago to start a new life after her parents died of cholera back in St. Louis. She had worked as a seamstress, lived in a boarding house with 3 other women, and tried to build something decent in this wild, lawless place. She had been doing fine until Marcus Thornton had set his sights on her, until he had started showing up at the dress shop where she worked, bringing flowers and speaking of marriage and a future together. She had never loved him. She had been polite, nothing more, but Marcus Thornton was not a man accustomed to being told no. He had grown more insistent, more possessive, and Clara had started to feel trapped by his attention. 2 weeks ago, she had finally told him clearly that she could not marry him, that she did not have those feelings for him. He had not taken it well. His face had gone dark, and he had grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave bruises, telling her she would regret making a fool of him in front of the whole town. 3 days later, he was dead, and she was arrested before his body was even cold. The sound of boots on the wooden floor outside her cell made Clara lift her head. Deputy Wilson walked past without looking at her, his keys jingling at his belt. He was the only law in Deadwood besides the Vigilantes, and he was too scared of them to do anything that might contradict their decisions. Clara had tried pleading with him, tried explaining that she was innocent, but he had just looked away and told her it was out of his hands. The evening dragged on with agonizing slowness. Clara could hear the sounds of Deadwood settling in for the night, the distant piano music from the saloons, the shouts and laughter of miners fresh from the claims, the rattle of wagon wheels on the dusty streets. Normal life continuing while hers was about to end. She thought about her parents, about whether she would see them again in whatever came after death. She thought about all the things she would never do, the life she would never have. She thought about dying at the end of a rope in front of a crowd of strangers who believed she was a murderer. She must have dozed off eventually because the next thing she knew, the sound of breaking glass jolted her awake. Her heart hammered in her chest as she sat up, disoriented in the darkness. The single lamp that had been burning on Deputy Wilson's desk was now extinguished, and the jailhouse was pitch black, except for the faint starlight coming through the windows. "Do not scream," a low voice said from directly outside her cell, and Clara nearly screamed anyway from the shock of it. "I am getting you out of here." "Who are you?" Clara whispered, her voice shaking. "Someone who knows you did not kill Marcus Thornton," the voice replied, and Clara heard the scrape of metal on metal as whoever it was worked on the lock of her cell. "Now be quiet and stay close to me. We have maybe 5 minutes before someone notices Wilson is unconscious." The lock clicked open and the cell door swung wide. In the faint light, Clara could make out the silhouette of a tall man wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a dark duster coat. He reached out a gloved hand toward her. "Come on," he said urgently. "We need to move." Clara's mind was spinning. This could be a trap. This could be someone who wanted to kill her before the hanging could take place. But what did it matter? If she stayed here, she was dead anyway. At least this way she had a chance. She grabbed his hand and let him pull her to her feet, her legs unsteady after hours of sitting. The man led her quickly through the dark jailhouse, stepping over the prone form of Deputy Wilson, who was sprawled on the floor, breathing but clearly knocked out cold. They slipped out the back door into an alley, and the cool night air hit Clara's face like a blessing. She had thought she would never breathe free air again. "This way," the man said, keeping his voice low. He had not released her hand, and his grip was strong and sure. They moved through the shadows between buildings, avoiding the main street where people were still milling about. Clara's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Every second she expected to hear shouts of alarm, to feel bullets tear into her back. But they made it to the edge of town where a horse was waiting, tied to a post behind the abandoned smithy. The horse was a beautiful bay gelding, tall and strong-looking, and as they approached it lifted its head and nickered softly. The man turned to Clara, and in the faint moonlight she could finally see his face. He was young, maybe 26 or 27, with strong features and serious eyes. A few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, and a jagged scar ran from his left temple down to his cheekbone. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said, though in truth she had not been on a horse in over a year, but she would learn again quickly if it meant staying alive. "Good. We are riding double until we can get you your own mount. His name is Copper." The man untied the horse and swung up into the saddle with easy grace, then reached down for Clara. She grasped his forearm and he hauled her up behind him as though she weighed nothing. "Hold on tight. We are going to ride hard." Clara wrapped her arms around his waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his coat. Before she could ask where they were going or who he was, he urged Copper forward and they were galloping out of Deadwood, leaving the town and its deadly rope behind them. They rode for what felt like hours through the darkness. The landscape of the Dakota Territory rolled past in shades of black and gray, all scrub grass and rocky outcroppings, and the occasional stand of ponderosa pine. The man steered them away from the main roads, keeping to game trails and creek beds where their passage would be harder to track. Clara clung to him, her arms aching from holding on, her body jostled by the horse's movement. She had so many questions burning in her mind, but the thunder of hooves and the rush of wind made conversation impossible. Finally, when the moon was high overhead and Clara's body was screaming with exhaustion, the man slowed Copper to a walk and then brought him to a stop in a small canyon where an overhanging rock formation would hide them from view. He dismounted and helped Clara down, and her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground. "We will rest here for a few hours," he said, his voice rough from the long silence. "They will be after us by now, but they will not be able to track us in the dark. We have until dawn." Clara leaned against a boulder, trying to catch her breath. Now that they had stopped moving, the reality of what had just happened was crashing down on her. She had escaped. This stranger had broken her out of jail and ridden her to safety, at least temporarily. She looked at him as he loosened Copper's cinch and pulled a canteen from his saddlebag. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face her and held out the canteen. "Drink first, then we will talk." Clara took the canteen with shaking hands and drank deeply. The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank until he gently took the canteen back. "My name is James Hawthorne," he said, meeting her eyes steadily. "And before you ask why I helped you, the answer is simple. I know you are innocent." "How?" Clara asked, feeling tears prick at her eyes for the first time since her arrest. Someone believed her. After all those hours of being called a murderer and a poisoner, someone actually believed her. James's expression hardened. "Because I know who really killed Marcus Thornton. And I have been trying to find proof for the last 3 days, but time ran out. When I heard the Vigilantes had set your hanging for dawn, I knew I could not let them murder an innocent woman while I was still working on clearing your name." Clara slid down the boulder until she was sitting on the ground, her dress dusty and torn from the hard ride. "Tell me, please tell me everything." James sat down across from her, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. In the moonlight, she could see the weariness etched into his face, the tension in his shoulders. Marcus Thornton had a business partner named Gerald Vance. They owned the Lucky Strike mine together, 50-50 split. But Thornton found a new vein of gold 3 weeks ago, a big one. He wanted to buy Vance out and take full ownership. Vance did not want to sell. They had a falling out. I heard them arguing about it in the Long Branch saloon 2 weeks ago. Vance was furious, said Thornton was trying to cheat him out of his rightful share. So Vance killed him. Clara asked, her mind racing. "I believe so. And more than that, I believe he saw an opportunity to frame you for it. Everyone in Deadwood knew Thornton was courting you, and everyone knew you had turned him down. It would not have been hard for Vance to slip poison into Thornton's drink and make sure you were nearby when he collapsed. Public rejection makes for a good murder motive in the eyes of people who do not know the full story." Clara felt sick. She had been a convenient scapegoat, nothing more. "But you said you have no proof." "Not yet. But I know Vance. I know the kind of man he is. I worked at the Lucky Strike for about a month when I first came to Deadwood last year, before I realized what kind of operation they were running. Vance is mean and he is greedy, and he would not hesitate to kill for money. Getting you out of that jail cell was the only way I could make sure justice had a chance of being served." "You risked your life for me," Clara said softly, "for someone you do not even know." James looked at her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable in the shadows. "I watched my sister hang for a crime she did not commit when I was 17 years old, down in Texas, in a town not much different from Deadwood. A group of vigilantes decided she had stolen from the general store because she was poor and had no family to defend her. They strung her up in the town square and I was powerless to stop it. I was just a kid, and there were too many of them. I watched her die, and I swore that day that I would never stand by and watch an innocent person be executed again if I had the power to stop it." Clara's heart clenched with sympathy and sorrow. "I am so sorry. Do not be sorry, just stay alive. That is all I ask." James stood up and walked to where Copper was grazing on a patch of dry grass. "Get some rest if you can. We have a hard ride ahead of us tomorrow." Clara wanted to ask where they were going, what the plan was, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight. She curled up on the hard ground, using her arm as a pillow, and closed her eyes. She thought she would be too frightened and too uncomfortable to sleep, but her body had other ideas. Within minutes, she was unconscious. She woke to James gently shaking her shoulder. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, though the sun had not yet risen. "We need to move," he said quietly. "I want to put as much distance between us and Deadwood as possible before they organize a proper search party." Clara sat up, her body stiff and aching. Every muscle protested as she stood, and she realized she had never been so sore in her life. James handed her a piece of jerky from his saddlebag, and she chewed it gratefully, even though it was tough and salty and nothing like a real meal. They mounted Copper again and headed south, riding at a steady pace that ate up the miles without exhausting the horse. As the sun rose, Clara could see the landscape more clearly. They were in rough country, all rolling hills and rocky terrain, with patches of pine forest and the occasional creek cutting through the land. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. "Where are we going?" Clara finally asked, her voice loud in the morning quiet. "There is a town called Spearfish about 30 miles south of here," James replied. "It is bigger than Deadwood, has an actual sheriff and a courthouse. If we can make it there, we have a chance of getting help. The Vigilantes from Deadwood do not have jurisdiction there, and they cannot just drag you back without going through proper legal channels." "And then what?" "I am still a fugitive. I still escaped from jail." "Then we find the proof we need to clear your name. We find evidence that Gerald Vance killed Marcus Thornton, and we bring it to the authorities in Spearfish. They can telegraph the territorial marshal, get a proper investigation started. It is a long shot, but it is the only shot we have." Clara was quiet for a moment, processing all of this. Then she asked the question that had been nagging at her since James had revealed his past. "Why are you still in the Dakota Territory? After what happened to your sister, why did you not leave Texas and go somewhere completely different?" She felt James tense slightly in the saddle. "Because running away does not change anything. I left Texas after my sister died because I could not stay in that town anymore, but I did not leave the kind of life she and I were born into. I am a cowboy, Miss Ashford. It is all I know how to be. I have worked ranches and mines and cattle drives from Texas to Montana, and I keep moving because staying in one place too long means forming attachments, and attachments mean pain when you lose them. But everywhere I go, I see the same injustices, the same good people being crushed by those with more power and fewer scruples. So I do what I can when I can, and I try to make sure that at least some of the time, the bad men do not win." Clara thought about this, thought about the kind of loneliness that must come from constantly moving, from never allowing yourself to call a place home. She thought about the courage it must take to keep fighting for justice when you had already lost so much. She found herself wanting to know more about James Hawthorne, this scarred cowboy who had saved her life. "You can call me Clara," she said softly. She felt rather than saw him smile. "Clara, then, and you can call me James." They rode through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping only briefly to rest Copper and share the meager supplies James had brought. Clara's initial soreness began to ease as her body adjusted to the rhythm of the horse, though she knew she would be covered in bruises tomorrow. They talked as they rode, carefully at first and then with growing comfort. Clara told James about her parents, about growing up in St. Louis, about her dream of one day opening her own dress shop. James told her about his years of wandering, about the beauty and brutality of the Western Territories, about the people he had met and the places he had seen. By the time the sun was beginning to set, they had covered a good distance, and James pointed to a cluster of buildings visible in the valley below. "That is Spearfish. We will reach it within the hour." But as they started down the slope toward the town, The sound of hoofbeats behind them made James pull Copper to a sharp halt. He twisted in the saddle, looking back the way they had come, and Clara followed his gaze. On the ridge behind them, silhouetted against the orange sky, were 5 riders. Even from this distance, Clara could see the determined set of their postures. "They found us," James said grimly. He urged Copper forward into a gallop, leaning low over the horse's neck. "Hold on tight." Clara wrapped her arms around James and pressed herself against his back as Copper surged forward with everything he had. The wind tore at her hair and dress, and she could hear the thunder of pursuing hooves growing louder behind them. James was pushing Copper hard, too hard, and Clara could feel the horse beginning to labor beneath them. They were carrying double, and the men behind them had fresh horses. They were not going to make it to Spearfish. The terrible certainty of it settled over Clara like a shroud. After everything, after the escape and the desperate flight and the glimmer of hope, they were going to be caught. A gunshot cracked through the air and Clara gasped, but James did not slow. Another shot, closer this time, and Clara heard the bullet whine past her head. They were shooting to kill, or at least shooting to stop them, and it did not matter which because the result would be the same. "There!" James shouted over the wind, pointing toward a rocky area to their left where a small canyon cut into the hillside. He steered Copper toward it, the horses' hooves sliding on loose shale as they plunged into the narrowing gap. The canyon walls rose on either side, blocking out the last of the daylight, and James slowed Copper to a walk, then a stop. "Get down," he said urgently, helping Clara dismount. He jumped down beside her and led Copper deeper into the canyon, where a tumble of boulders created a natural fortification. He pulled his rifle from the saddle scabbard and quickly checked to make sure it was loaded. "James, what are we doing?" Clara asked, fear making her voice shake. "Those men are not going to stop chasing us just because we ask nicely," James said, his jaw set. "And Copper cannot carry us both any further at the pace we need, so we make a stand here. Maybe we get lucky and they decide we are not worth the trouble. Maybe we do not get lucky and I have to persuade them with bullets." "You cannot fight 5 men alone," Clara said desperately. "I can try." James positioned himself behind one of the larger boulders, his rifle at the ready. He looked back at Clara and his expression softened slightly. "Stay down and stay quiet. If something happens to me, if they get past me, you run. You run as fast and as far as you can, and you find someone in Spearfish who will listen to your story. Promise me. James, promise me, Clara." "I promise," Clara whispered, even though she knew she could never leave him to face those men alone. The sound of hooves echoed in the canyon, and then voices. The pursuers had followed them in and were approaching cautiously, aware that this was the perfect place for an ambush. Clara crouched behind James, her heart in her throat, and waited. "James Hawthorne," a voice called out, bouncing off the canyon walls. "We know you are in there. Send out the girl and we will let you ride away. You do not want to die for a murderer." "She is not a murderer," James shouted back. "And I am not handing her over to a lynch mob. Then you are going to die with her. We have 5 men and plenty of ammunition. You cannot win this fight." James did not respond. He kept his rifle trained on the canyon entrance, his breathing steady and controlled. Clara could see the tension in his shoulders, could see the way his finger rested lightly on the trigger. This man was prepared to die for her, a woman he had known for less than 24 hours, because his conscience would not let him do otherwise. The decision crystallized in Clara's mind with sudden clarity. She could not let that happen. She could not let James Hawthorne sacrifice himself for her when she had another option. Before she could second-guess herself, she stood up and stepped out from behind the boulder. "I am coming out," she called, her voice ringing through the canyon. "Do not shoot. I'm coming out." "Clara, no." James grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with shock and something that looked like fear. "You are not dying for me," Clara said firmly, meeting his gaze. "I will not have another death on my conscience, especially not the death of a good man who was only trying to help me. Let me go, James, please." "They are going to kill you," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "Maybe, or maybe I can still talk my way out of this. But even if I cannot, at least you will be alive. You can keep fighting for other people who need help. You can keep making sure the bad men do not always win." Clara gently pulled her arm free and started walking toward the canyon entrance. She had taken maybe 5 steps when the gunshot rang out. Clara flinched and stopped, expecting to feel pain, expecting to fall, but nothing happened. Then she heard a shout of alarm from where the pursuing men were waiting and the sound of horses whinnying in panic. "Federal Marshal, drop your weapons." A new voice boomed through the canyon, and Clara spun around in confusion. James was on his feet now, looking as bewildered as Clara felt. From the canyon entrance, a group of 7 men rode in, and Clara could see the glint of marshal badges on their vests. The 5 vigilantes from Deadwood had their hands in the air, their guns on the ground, surrounded by the lawmen. An older man with a gray beard and a weathered face rode forward and tipped his hat to Clara. "Madam, are you Clara Ashford?" "Yes, I am," Clara managed to say, her mind reeling. "And you must be James Hawthorne," the marshal said, looking at James. "We have been looking for you both for the better part of the day." "Looking for us," James said warily, his rifle still in his hands though he had lowered it. "Why?" The marshal dismounted and walked closer. "Because about 3 hours after you broke Miss Ashford out of jail, a man named Gerald Vance was found dead in his room at the Grand Hotel in Deadwood. Poisoned, same as Marcus Thornton. And before he died, he confessed to everything. Wrote it all down in a letter that he left on his bedside table. Said he killed Thornton for the mine, and he framed Miss Ashford because it was convenient. Then I guess the guilt got to him, or maybe he was just afraid of getting caught himself, so he took the same poison he had used on Thornton. By the time anybody found him, he was dead." Clara felt her knees go weak, and suddenly James was there, his arm around her waist, holding her up. "She is cleared?" James asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "She is cleared," the marshal confirmed. "The vigilantes in Deadwood are not happy about it, but the law is the law. Miss Ashford is a free woman. As for you, Mr. Hawthorne, breaking someone out of jail is still a crime, even if that someone turns out to be innocent. But given the circumstances, and given that you likely saved Miss Ashford from a wrongful hanging, the territorial governor has agreed to pardon you. You are both free to go." Clara turned her face into James's shoulder and felt the tears she had been holding back for days finally spill over. She was sobbing, great gasping sobs of relief and disbelief and overwhelming emotion. She felt James's arms tighten around her, felt his cheek rest against the top of her head. "It is over," he murmured. "You are safe. It is over." The marshal gave them a moment, then cleared his throat. "We will be escorting these men back to Deadwood to face charges for attempted murder and vigilante justice. Miss Ashford, you are welcome to come with us if you want to reclaim your belongings and your place in town. Mr. Hawthorne, I am guessing you will be moving on now that the excitement is over." James did not answer right away. Clara pulled back enough to look up at him, and she saw something conflicted in his eyes. He was a drifter. He had said so himself. He never stayed in one place long enough to form attachments, and yet, "What if I do not want to go back to Deadwood?" Clara heard herself say. "What if I would rather go wherever James is going?" James looked down at her in surprise. "Clara, you have a life there, a job, friends, a home." "I have a job sewing dresses for miners' wives and a rented room in a boarding house," Clara corrected. I have been in Deadwood for 6 months, and the only thing I have to show for it is a false murder charge and a near hanging. And the only person who stood up for me, who believed in me enough to risk everything to save me, was you. So yes, I would like to go wherever you are going if you will have me." She saw something shift in James's expression, something warm and wondering. "I am not an easy man to travel with," he said quietly. "I do not have much in the way of money or prospects. I have a horse and a bedroll and a tendency to move around a lot." "Then it is a good thing I am not looking for easy," Clara said, and she smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. The marshal chuckled. "Well, that is settled then. You two best head into Spearfish for the night, get some rest and some hot food. You both look like you could use it. And Miss Ashford, if you decide you do want your belongings from Deadwood sent to you, just let me know where you end up settling, and I will make sure they get to you." "Thank you, Marshal," Clara said sincerely. The lawman rounded up the sullen vigilantes and rode back out of the canyon, leaving James and Clara alone with Copper and the gathering darkness. James looked down at Clara, his hand still resting on her waist, and he shook his head slowly. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Really sure?" "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," Clara said, and she realized it was true. In the span of one terrifying, exhilarating day and night, everything had changed. She had lost her old life and gained something new and undefined, something that felt like possibility. And at the center of it was this man with his scarred face and his tragic past, and his unshakable sense of right and wrong. James smiled, a real smile that lit up his whole face and made him look younger. "Then I guess we should get you to Spearfish and find you a decent meal and a bed for the night. And tomorrow we can figure out where we go from here." They rode into Spearfish as the stars began to appear overhead, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Clara felt something like hope unfurling in her chest. She was alive. She was free. And she was riding toward an uncertain future with a man who had already proven he would risk everything for her. It was, she thought, a pretty good place to start. Spearfish was bigger than Deadwood, with wider streets and more permanent-looking buildings. There was a proper hotel in the town center, and James paid for 2 rooms with the last of his money. Clara felt guilty about that, until she reminded herself that she had some savings back in Deadwood that could be sent to her. For tonight, she would accept his generosity. The hotel owner's wife took one look at Clara's dusty, torn dress and offered her a bath and a change of clothes. Clara accepted gratefully, and an hour later she was clean for the first time in days, wearing a borrowed cotton dress that was a little too big but infinitely better than her ruined clothes. Her own dress had been her best one, made by her own hands with careful stitches and attention to detail. And she mourned its loss even as she recognized how ridiculous it was to care about a dress after everything else that had happened. She met James downstairs in the hotel's dining room, and his eyes widened slightly when he saw her. "You look different," he said, then seemed to realize how that sounded and added quickly, "I mean, you look well. Better. Rested." Clara smiled and sat down across from him. "I feel almost human again. How about you?" "Same. A wash and a shave does wonders." He gestured to his clean-shaven face, and Clara realized she had not seen him without the stubble until now. He looked even younger this way, and she found herself thinking he was quite handsome, in a rough-around-the-edges sort of way. They ordered dinner and ate in companionable silence for a while, both of them too hungry to talk. The food was simple but good: steak and potatoes and beans, with fresh bread and butter. Clara thought it was the best meal she had ever eaten, though that might have been because the last thing she had consumed was jerky and water on the run. "So, James said when they had both taken the edge off their hunger. "We should probably talk about what happens next." Clara nodded, setting down her fork. "I meant what I said earlier. I do not want to go back to Deadwood. Even though I have been cleared, I do not think I could stand to live in a town where so many people were ready to believe the worst of me, where they were ready to watch me hang without a second thought." "I understand that," James said. "But Clara, you need to think about what you are giving up. You had a trade, a skill. You could go to any town and find work as a seamstress. But if you come with me, it is going to be a hard life. I do not even know where I am going next. I was thinking about heading west to Wyoming, maybe finding work on one of the big cattle ranches there. It is not glamorous and it is not steady." "I do not need glamorous," Clara said firmly. "I grew up poor, James. My father was a warehouse worker and my mother took in laundry. I know what hard work looks like, and I am good with a needle, yes, but I am also good with my hands in general. I can cook, I can clean, I can do a dozen things that might be useful. And more than that, I can learn. I am not some delicate flower who will wilt at the first sign of difficulty." James studied her for a long moment, and Clara met his gaze steadily. Finally, he nodded. "All right. But we do this properly. We get you your belongings from Deadwood, whatever you want sent. We pool our resources and we make a plan, and we travel as friends. I will not take advantage of the situation or of you. I want to be clear about that." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. In a world where men like Marcus Thornton thought they could pressure and manipulate women into doing what they wanted, James Hawthorne was offering her respect and protection without expecting anything in return. "Friends," she agreed. "For now." Something flickered in James's eyes at those last two words, but he just nodded and returned his attention to his dinner. They spent 3 days in Spearfish while waiting for Clara's belongings to be sent from Deadwood. During that time, they got to know each other better. James showed Clara around the town, such as it was, and they talked for hours about everything and nothing. Clara learned that James was 26, that he had been born in East Texas to a farming family, that he had a scar on his hand from a knife fight with a man who had tried to steal his horse in New Mexico. James learned that Clara loved books, that she had once dreamed of being a teacher, but her family could not afford to send her to school long enough for her to get certified, that she had a terrible sweet tooth and would do almost anything for a piece of chocolate. On the 3rd day, a package arrived from Deadwood containing Clara's clothes, her sewing kit, her small collection of books, and a bank draft for the money she had in savings. It was not much, but it was enough to contribute to their traveling fund. James also managed to pick up some work around town fixing fences and mucking stables that earned him enough to buy supplies for the road and to purchase a second horse for Clara. The horse was a gentle gray mare named Willow, and Clara fell in love with her immediately. On the morning of the 4th day, they left Spearfish heading west toward the Wyoming border. The late summer weather was perfect for traveling, warm days and cool nights, and they fell into an easy rhythm. They would ride during the daylight hours, stopping to rest the horses and eat lunch, then make camp in the evenings wherever they could find water and shelter. James taught Clara how to build a proper campfire, how to unsaddle and care for her horse, how to read the stars for navigation. Clara surprised him by proving to be an excellent camp cook, able to make even basic supplies taste good with the right combination of seasoning and technique. As the days turned into weeks, Clara found herself watching James more and more. She watched the way he moved, economical and sure. She watched the way he treated the horses, with gentleness and respect. She watched the way he looked at her when he thought she was not paying attention, with something soft and wondering in his eyes, and she felt something growing inside her chest, something warm and sweet and terrifying. She was falling in love with James Hawthorne. She tried to tell herself it was just gratitude, just the natural attachment that forms between people who have been through a traumatic experience together. But she knew it was more than that. It was the way her heart leaped when she heard his voice in the morning. It was the way she felt safest when he was near. It was the way she found herself imagining a future with him, something more permanent than this wandering existence. But James had made it clear they were friends, and Clara did not want to push for something he might not be ready to give. So she kept her feelings to herself and tried to be content with what they had. They crossed into Wyoming in mid-September, and the landscape began to change. The Black Hills gave way to rolling grasslands, vast and open under an endless blue sky. They saw herds of antelope and the occasional group of wild horses. Once, they came across a small band of Lakota Sioux travelers, and James spoke with them in their own language, trading tobacco for information about the road ahead. Clara was impressed and asked him where he had learned to speak Lakota. "I spent a winter with a Lakota village about 5 years ago," James explained as they rode on. "I helped them hunt buffalo, and they taught me their language. Good people, though they are having a harder and harder time now with the government pushing them onto reservations and breaking treaties left and right. It is a shameful business, the way we treat them." Clara agreed, though she knew her opinion on such matters carried little weight in the world. Still, she appreciated that James saw the injustice of it, that he was willing to speak against the prevailing attitudes of most white settlers. They reached the town of Buffalo, Wyoming in late September, and James found work at a ranch just outside of town. The owner, a gruff but fair man named Tom Patterson, needed extra hands for the fall roundup, and he agreed to take on both James and Clara. Clara would work as a cook for the ranch hands, and James would work with the cattle. The pay was decent, and Patterson offered them the use of a small cabin on the edge of the property. "It is not much," Patterson said, showing them the cabin. It was a single room with a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. "But it has got a good roof, and it is warm." "You two are married, I assume?" Clara and James looked at each other. "No, we are not," James said carefully. "We are traveling companions." Patterson raised his eyebrows. "Well, I am running a respectable operation here. I cannot have unmarried folks living together under my employ. Scandalizes the other hands and their families. So either you get married, or I can offer you separate lodging. Mr. Hawthorne can bunk with the other cowboys, and Miss Ashford can stay in the main house with my wife and daughters." Clara felt her face flush. She opened her mouth to say that separate lodging would be fine, but James spoke first. "Give us a moment to discuss it, if you would, sir." Patterson nodded and stepped outside, leaving Clara and James alone in the small cabin. "You do not have to do this," Clara said quickly. "I know marriage was not part of our agreement. We can stay in separate places. It is fine." James was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "What if I want to do this?" he said finally. Clara stared at him. "What, Clara?" James took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign that he was nervous. "I know we have only known each other for a few weeks. I know this is crazy and fast and probably foolish, but I cannot stop thinking about you. I cannot stop wanting to be near you. Every time I look at you, I feel like my chest is too tight and I cannot breathe properly. I have been telling myself it is just friendship, just companionship on the road, but I am done lying to myself. I think I am falling in love with you. And if you feel even a fraction of the same way, then maybe getting married is not such a bad idea. We could make a real go of it, build a life together. But if you do not feel that way, if I have misread this whole situation. Then just tell me, and we will get the separate lodging, and we will never speak of this again." Clara's heart was thundering so hard she thought it might break right out of her ribs. For a moment she could not speak, could not find the words to express the explosion of joy and relief and love that was flooding through her. "You are falling in love with me," she managed to say. "Yes," James said simply. "I am falling in love with you, Clara Ashford. Probably have been since the moment you stood up in that canyon and tried to sacrifice yourself so I would not get hurt. You are brave and strong and kind, and you are beautiful in a way that makes me forget how to think straight. So yes, I am in love with you. And I would be honored if you would consider marrying me, even though I have nothing to offer you but a hard life and an uncertain future." Clara closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps and threw her arms around his neck. "Yes," she said against his shoulder. "Yes, I will marry you. Because I am in love with you too, James Hawthorne. I have been trying so hard not to be, trying to tell myself it was too soon and too fast, but I cannot help it. I love you." She felt James's arms come around her, strong and sure, and then he was lifting her off her feet and spinning her around in the small space of the cabin. When he set her down, they were both laughing, giddy with the sudden shift in their reality. "We are getting married," James said, as though testing out the words. "We are getting married," Clara confirmed, and then James was kissing her, his lips warm and gentle on hers, and Clara melted into him, into this perfect moment that felt like the beginning of everything good. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless. James rested his forehead against hers and said, "I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this decision." "I know," Clara said. "And I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it either." They told Patterson they would take the cabin, and 2 days later they were married by the local preacher in a simple ceremony with Patterson and his wife as witnesses. Clara wore her best dress, the one she had sewn herself back in Deadwood, and that had been sent to her in Spearfish. James wore his cleanest shirt and a new vest that Patterson's wife had insisted on lending him. The ceremony was brief and to the point, but when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and James kissed her in front of God and witnesses, Clara felt like the luckiest woman in the world. They worked at the Patterson ranch through the fall and into the winter. The work was hard but satisfying, and Clara discovered that she loved the rhythm of ranch life. She cooked for the hands, mended their clothes, and learned to can vegetables for the winter. James worked from dawn until dusk with the cattle, coming home exhausted but content. In the evenings, they would sit together in their little cabin, talking or reading or simply enjoying each other's company. And at night, in the narrow bed that barely fit them both, Clara learned what it meant to be loved by a good man, what it meant to give herself fully to another person and to be cherished in return. James was gentle and patient, always concerned with her comfort and pleasure, and Clara fell deeper in love with him every day. Winter in Wyoming was brutal, but they weathered it together. Snow piled up outside their cabin, and the temperature dropped so low that the water in their wash basin froze overnight. But inside they were warm, wrapped up in quilts and each other. Clara taught James how to play card games she had learned from her father, and James taught Clara how to whittle, showing her how to turn a simple piece of wood into something beautiful with just a knife and patience. When spring came, Patterson offered them permanent positions at the ranch, and Clara and James seriously considered it. They had grown to love the place and the people, and it would have been easy to stay. But James had the wanderer's soul, and after a long discussion, they decided to move on. They wanted to see more of the West, to experience more of what this wild land had to offer before settling down for good. They said their goodbyes to the Pattersons and the other ranch hands in early April of 1877 and set out north toward Montana. They had saved up enough money to purchase better supplies and equipment, and they traveled at a leisurely pace, stopping in small towns and working short-term jobs when they needed to replenish their funds. In Montana, they worked for a few months at a trading post near the Yellowstone River, living in a room above the store and serving the trappers and prospectors and cattlemen who came through. Clara learned to speak a bit of Crow from the native women who came to trade, and James worked as a guide for some of the wealthier clients who wanted to hunt in the mountains. It was in Montana that Clara realized she was pregnant. She had missed her monthly courses twice, and she was plagued by morning sickness that left her exhausted and queasy. When she told James, he looked terrified for about 5 seconds, and then his face broke into the biggest smile she had ever seen. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "You are going to be a mother and I am going to be a father. Are you happy about it?" Clara asked, suddenly nervous. They had never discussed children, had never planned for this, and she worried that James might see it as a burden, as something that would tie them down. "Happy?" James pulled her into his arms and held her close. "Clara, I am beyond happy. I am terrified out of my mind, but I am happy. We are going to have a family. A real family." They decided it was time to stop wandering and find a place to settle, at least for a few years while they raised their child. They had heard that Colorado was opening up with new opportunities, and in June of 1877 they made their way south to the town of Durango in the southwestern corner of the territory. Durango was a railroad town, growing fast with the expansion of the Denver and Rio Grande Railway. There was work to be found and land to be had, and James and Clara fell in love with the place almost immediately. The San Juan Mountains rose up around the town like protective walls, and the Animas River ran clean and cold through the valley. It felt like a place they could build a future. James found work with a local rancher, and Clara used some of their savings to rent a small house in town. It was not much, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it was theirs. Clara spent her days preparing for the baby, sewing tiny clothes and blankets, and James spent his days working hard to save up money to buy their own piece of land. Their son was born in February of 1878, during a snowstorm that blanketed the town in white. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Clara thought she might not survive it, but James was with her the whole time, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. When the baby finally came, red-faced and screaming with healthy lungs, Clara wept with relief and exhaustion and overwhelming love. They named him Thomas, after James's father who had died when James was young. Thomas had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and he was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever seen. The first year of parenthood was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Clara had never been so tired in her life, but she had also never been so happy. Watching James with their son, seeing the gentleness and love in every interaction, made her fall in love with him all over again. When Thomas was 6 months old, James came home one day with news. The rancher he worked for was selling off parcels of land, and James had been offered a good price on 40 acres about 5 miles outside of town. It was not a lot, but it was enough to start their own small ranch, to build something that would belong to them and their children. They took out a loan for what they could not pay outright, and by Thomas's first birthday, they were living in a small cabin on their own land. It was rough living at first, but they worked together to improve the place. James built corrals and a barn while Clara established a garden and started raising chickens. They bought a few head of cattle and some horses, and slowly, year by year, they built their ranch into something prosperous. Their daughter, Elizabeth, was born in the summer of 1880, and she was as different from Thomas as night from day. Where Thomas was serious and thoughtful, Elizabeth was wild and laughing, always getting into mischief. She had her father's determination and her mother's stubborn streak, and Clara and James loved her fiercely. The years passed in a blur of hard work and small joys. Thomas grew into a quiet, intelligent boy who loved books and animals. Elizabeth grew into a spirited girl who could ride a horse before she could write her name. In 1883, Clara gave birth to their third child, a boy they named Samuel, and their family felt complete. The ranch prospered. James's reputation for fair dealing and quality livestock spread throughout the region, and they always had buyers for their cattle and horses. Clara sold eggs and vegetables in town, and took in sewing work when time allowed. They paid off their loan within 5 years and were able to expand their holdings, eventually owning over 100 acres of good grazing land. But it was not all easy. There were droughts and harsh winters. There were times when money was tight and they had to scrape by on next to nothing. There was the year Thomas got sick with a fever that nearly took him from them, and the weeks of desperate worry until he finally recovered. There was the night a mountain lion got into the chicken coop and killed half their flock. There were arguments and disagreements and moments when the stress of trying to build a life in such an unforgiving place threatened to break them. But through it all, Clara and James had each other. And that, Clara came to understand, was the most important thing. The love that had sparked between them on that desperate flight from Deadwood had grown into something deep and unshakable, something that could weather any storm. She would sometimes think back to that night in the jail cell, to the rope waiting in the corner and the certainty that she was going to die. She would think about James breaking her out, about the wild ride through the darkness, about the moment in that canyon when she had tried to save him by sacrificing herself. It felt like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to different people. But then she would look at James across the dinner table, his face lined now with age and sun and hard work, his hair touched with gray at the temples, and she would see the same man who had risked everything for a stranger because it was the right thing to do. She would see the same integrity, the same courage, the same fundamental goodness that had made her fall in love with him in the first place. And she would feel grateful, so profoundly grateful, that fate had brought them together in that terrible moment, and that they had chosen each other every day since. On their 10th wedding anniversary, James surprised Clara by taking her into Durango for the evening. They left the children with their neighbor and dressed in their best clothes, and James took her to dinner at the finest restaurant in town. It was a luxury they rarely allowed themselves, but James said it was important to mark the occasion. Over roast beef and wine, James took Clara's hand and looked into her eyes with that same intensity he had shown in Patterson's cabin all those years ago. "You remember what I said to you the day I asked you to marry me?" he asked. "You said a lot of things," Clara said with a smile. "Which part specifically?" "I said I would spend the rest of my life making sure you never regretted your decision to marry me, and I want to know, 10 years later, if I have kept that promise." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. "James Hawthorne, you have given me a life beyond anything I ever dreamed possible. You have given me love and children and a home. You have stood by me through every difficulty and celebrated every joy with me. I have never regretted marrying you, not for a single moment. You are the best man I have ever known, and I love you more today than I did the day we got married." James brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "I love you too, Clara. You saved me, you know. I was drifting, going nowhere, running from my past and afraid to build a future. And then I met you, and suddenly I had a reason to stop running. You gave me a purpose and a home, and I will never be able to repay you for that." "You already have," Clara said softly. "Every single day you already have." They stayed in town that night, renting a room at the hotel, and it felt almost scandalous to be alone together without the children, to have uninterrupted time to talk and laugh and love each other. It reminded Clara of their early days together, when they were still figuring out who they were as a couple, and it made her appreciate how far they had come. The years continued to pass. Thomas grew into a fine young man, tall and strong like his father, with a love for ranching that made both James and Clara proud. He married a sweet girl from town named Anna, and they built a house on the far corner of the property and started raising their own family. Elizabeth, true to her wild nature, shocked everyone by announcing at age 18 that she wanted to become a schoolteacher, and she left home to attend teacher training in Denver. Samuel, the baby of the family, was still finding his way, working the ranch alongside his father and brother and dreaming of adventure beyond the mountains. Clara and James grew older, their bodies marked by the years of hard labor, but their love for each other never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger with time, tempered by shared experiences and deepened by mutual respect. On a warm evening in the summer of 1895, Clara and James sat on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the San Juan Mountains. They were both in their 50s now, their children grown, their ranch successful beyond their early dreams. Thomas and Anna's children, Clara and James's grandchildren, were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "Can you believe this is our life?" Clara said, leaning against James's shoulder. "Sometimes I still can't quite believe we made it here, that all of this is real." James wrapped his arm around her and pulled her close. "I can believe it, because we built it together, piece by piece. We worked for it and fought for it and never gave up on each other." "Do you ever think about Deadwood?" Clara asked. "About that night?" "Sometimes," James admitted. "I think about how close I came to never meeting you, or meeting you too late to save you. I think about all the ways things could have gone wrong. And then I look at what we have now, and I think about how everything that happened, as terrible as it was, led us to this moment, led us to this life." Clara nodded, understanding. She had similar thoughts herself, late at night when sleep eluded her. The what-ifs and the might-have-beens. But then she would feel James beside her, warm and solid and real, and the questions would fade away, replaced by gratitude for what was. "I would go through it all again," Clara said quietly. "The terror and the danger and the uncertainty. I would go through all of it again if I knew it would lead me to you." James kissed the top of her head. "And I would break you out of that jail cell 1,000 times over, ride through 1,000 dark nights, if it meant I got to spend my life with you." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from orange to purple to deep blue, as the first stars began to appear overhead. In the house behind them, Clara could hear Anna preparing dinner, could smell the savory scent of cooking meat and fresh bread. Thomas's voice carried from the barn, calling to one of the hands about feeding the horses. One of the grandchildren, Clara thought it might be their oldest grandson, James Jr., ran past the porch, chasing after his younger sister with a stick, both of them shrieking with laughter. This was their legacy, Clara thought. This life they had built, this family they had created, this love that had sustained them through nearly 20 years of marriage and would continue to sustain them for whatever years they had left. It had all started with a rope and a jailhouse and a cowboy who chose to do the right thing even when it was dangerous, even when it would have been easier to look away. "Thank you," Clara said, turning to look at James's face, at the gray in his hair and the lines around his eyes, at the scar on his cheek that she had long since stopped noticing. "For what?" James asked, though his eyes were soft with understanding. "For saving me, for loving me, for building this life with me, for everything." James cupped her face in his weathered hand and looked at her with such love that Clara felt her breath catch. "You have nothing to thank me for. You saved me just as much as I saved you. We saved each other, Clara. That is what love does." And then he kissed her, gentle and sweet, as the stars wheeled overhead and their grandchildren played in the yard, and the mountains stood eternal watch over the life they had built together. Years later, when Clara was an old woman with snow-white hair and grandchildren turning into great-grandchildren, she would tell the story of how she and James had met. The young ones would gather around her chair by the fireplace, wide-eyed with wonder, and she would tell them about the Vigilantes and the false accusation, about the rope waiting in the jail cell, and the certain knowledge that she was going to die. She would tell them about the cowboy who broke her out in the middle of the night, about the desperate flight through the darkness, about falling in love on the open trail. She would tell them that sometimes love comes in unexpected ways, born from crisis and danger, but that does not make it any less real or less lasting. She would tell them that the best kind of love is the kind that chooses you over and over again, through good times and bad, through prosperity and hardship, through youth and age. And she would look across the room at James, still there beside her after all these years, still her partner and her love and her best friend, and she would know that every word she told them was true. That their love story, which had begun with such fear and desperation, had become something beautiful and enduring, something worth every hardship they had faced along the way. The Vigilantes had said she had to hang by morning. A cowboy had broken her out and rode her to safety. But more than that, so much more than that, he had given her a life worth living, a love worth dying for, and a legacy that would endure long after they were both gone. And in the end, Clara thought, that was the greatest gift of all. Not just survival, but a life fully lived. Not just safety, but love. Not just escape from death, but the building of something meaningful and lasting in its place. She had been given a second chance that night in Deadwood, and she and James had made the most of it. They had taken that desperate beginning and transformed it into decades of partnership, of family, of love that deepened with every passing year. They had faced down hardship and loss, celebrated victories and weathered defeats, and through it all they had chosen each other, over and over again. When James passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1908, at the age of 76, Clara held his hand and wept for the man who had been her whole world for more than 30 years. But even in her grief, she felt grateful. Grateful for every day they had shared, every moment they had built together, every choice that had led them to each other and kept them together until the very end. And when Clara followed him 2 years later, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, her last thought was of that night in the canyon when she had stepped out from behind the boulder, ready to sacrifice herself for him. She had not known then that he would become her whole world, that the scared young woman facing death and the determined young cowboy breaking her free would build something so beautiful together. But she knew it now. And as she closed her eyes for the last time, she smiled, thinking of James waiting for her, ready to ride together into whatever came next, just as they had ridden together through all the challenges and joys of their long, full life. The story of James and Clara Hawthorne became something of a legend in the Durango area, passed down through generations of their descendants. The ranch they had built continued to thrive, worked by their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. and every year on the anniversary of their wedding, the family would gather and someone would tell the story of how it all began, of the Vigilantes and the jailhouse and the cowboy who chose love over safety, justice over convenience, and gave a condemned woman a second chance at life. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering. A story of love born from crisis, of courage in the face of injustice, of two people who found each other in the darkest moment and built something lasting from the ashes of despair. It was, in every sense, the story of a love that saved two lives and created a legacy that would endure for generations to come.